Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Karten Lecture 2025. We're delighted to have Sasha Goldstein-Tabach here this evening with us. And this lecture, is in memory of Ian and Mildred Karten, for whom we thank for their ongoing support. So tonight's talk is entitled Jewish Networks in the Age of Empire, and we're delighted to have Sasha tonight, so take it away and then we'll ask questions at the end. Yeah.
And I am delighted to be here tonight. So this talk, although it's an annual lecture, I'm actually talking about kind of my research going forward. So Sammy asked me, he's like, oh, is there any publication I should read to prepare? Well, I hope the publications will come. But I'm here for the next month as the Parks Fellow. And so I'm actually going to be working in the archive most of the time. And so this talk is really about what I'm looking for in the archives here. Because I'm going to speak a little bit about the Anglo-Jewish Association. For those of you who don't know what it is, don't worry, I will talk about it. But those archives are housed at the University of Southampton. So that's kind of how this all comes together. But first I realized I need to do the slides, and this is not, it will work. It just, it's funny to the first one. Okay. Or a slide thing. Okay. And then we'll. So what is the age of empire? I guess there are lots of definitions, but in this case, I'm really talking about the long 19th century, right? Kind of the rise of not just European empires. I mean, we think about the British Empire, we think about the French Empire, but we can also think about the last century of the Ottoman Empire. And that's certainly going to be very important in my talk today, because although I focus on the Jewish communities of the Middle East and North Africa, my argument is that the Jewish communities of the Middle East and North Africa primarily live within the Ottoman Empire, and if not in Morocco, which will go from being an independent sultanate in the 19th century into being a French protectorate in the early 20th century. But that between that empire and the French and British empires, but then also the empires of Eastern Europe, Jews are connected. And that they're connected in ways that they were not necessarily connected in previous centuries, in previous periods. And so when we think about what brings disparate Jewish communities together, we think about themes around colonialism, philanthropy, mitigating anti-Semitism or responding to anti-Semitism, an emergent public sphere, migration, right? We think about in this period, especially in the late 19th century, Eastern European Jews moving to Western Europe and then many going on to North America. Also, you have migration within the Middle East and North Africa, both regional, but also to other continents, and the global press, which is certainly part of this public sphere. Okay, again, the slide, pressing, maybe here, we'll do it that one. No? I don't know why. Okay, just double click. And so my argument is that this is also the period where we begin to see a globalization of Jewish identity. And that part of this comes from networks that a global Jewish aristocracy puts in place. And obviously this is kind of a problematic term. And sometimes it evokes anti-Semitic tropes, so we have to be careful about that. But thinking about, well, what makes these Jewish elites connected, and why are they becoming connected? And I think one important thing to think about is that the 19th century, the early 20th century, we don't have the welfare state, right, as we know it today in Western Europe, for example. And so welfare comes from religious communities. And so these elites, along with spiritual ecclesiastical leadership, they very much make decisions about their religious communities. And when Jews are in times of need, when they have problems, and when they're traveling, they go to Jewish communal institutions. So we have these Jewish, we can call them aristocrats, we can call them elites, and they come into closer contact with each other. And so one of the things also, for those of you who know the Jewish Country Houses project at Oxford, with Abigail Green and Jacqueline Granick, like these are the types of things we've been thinking about. I've been thinking about, well, what happens with the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa? And I think this in the 19th and early 20th century is something very important to think about, because of course Zionist historiography very much speaks about kind of this coming together, this kibbutz galuyot of the Holy Land, the land of Israel. But these are not the discussions which are happening primarily in the 19th century. Within communal leaders, right? Zionist ideology as a political movement very much comes about in the late 19th century, and as kind of the dominant Jewish intellectual project that actually coalesces much, much later in a context of the rise of Nazism. And so I think it's important to study how these Jewish communal elites work together to really understand how Jewish communities were addressing communal issues in this period. And just to kind of give you one visual of thinking about these networks in an interesting way, this is a picture from the early 20th century. I'd love to have pictures from the early 19th century. Those are more difficult to find, of course. But this is the picture. Does anyone in the room identify anyone in this picture? I would only expect people to be able to identify one person. Yeah, it's Albert Einstein. And the picture is from 1922. And Albert Einstein is in Singapore. And he is in Singapore raising money for the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And who is he raising money from? He's raising money from the Baghdadi Jewish elite, because the Baghdadi Jews established a satellite community in Singapore in the late 19th century. And they very much become part of kind of the British Empire in terms of their vision. They build networks both with Anglo Jewry. They stay very much connected to Baghdadi Jewry. They remit funds back to Baghdad. They're regularly going back and forth. They're interested in Jewish ideas, Jewish intellectual projects, like the building of the Hebrew University. And they're connected enough that Albert Einstein, when he goes to raise funds, he knows about this community. And so this is kind of in the period, I'm thinking about a late manifestation of these types of connections that I am beginning to think about. So what are the 19th century challenges that these elites are trying to address or thinking about how to address? And you can ask, why do they care about their co-religionists? And there are various reasons for this. We can talk about a religious feeling of obligation. We can talk about concerns that if people in their community do bad things, then they will be blamed for it. So there are certainly different pushes and pulls factors that put these communal elites in this position. But most people live in some form of poverty or economic insecurity. Public health is an issue. Education is limited, particularly secular education, varying levels of political insecurity, and lack of public infrastructure. And these are challenges kind of shared by all regions and all religious communities in this period. So nothing's really special about that. Now, it's important, if we're looking at this change in addressing these issues and this change, why somebody like Albert Einstein would then stop off at in the Jewish community in Singapore to try to raise funds, it's important to take a quick moment and look at kind of pre-modern Jewish leadership in government, right? So, as I said earlier, most communities are governed by a mixture of secular or lay and religious leadership. And this secular leadership often acts as a liaison with non-Jewish officials, right? With whoever is in power, be it a local governor, a czar, in the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan, again, the local governors, the city mayors, what have you. They're responsible for tax collection, depending on the way taxes are levied on the community. And it's usually made up of commercial elites. And then you have a spiritual leadership who defines civil and criminal law, particularly in the Islamic world, where Jews have tremendous autonomy within their communities to define their own civil and criminal law when it involves two Jews. but as I think everybody in this room knows, and probably most people online know, there is no leadership on a global level, right? This is all very, very local. Even with the Ottoman reforms in the mid-19th century, the Tanzimat reforms, they then put Jews into a hierarchy. There's a lot of pushback, right? Why? Because they don't necessarily see themselves always as being connected to these disparate Jewish groups. So you have trade networks, you have networks of information. We know that rabbis speak to each other. It's not that they're completely divested from each other, but most of the exchanges go through places of origin, which are also very much connected to religious practice. So like Sephardi trade network, and even Sephardi is kind of a big word because there are huge differences between like the Western Sephardi communities, so those in Amsterdam, London, Manchester, and then going into the New World, Baghdadi, right? The group I was talking about prior, Maghrebi, certain North African communities who also might identify as Sephardi, but it's kind of a different network, right? And then Ashkenazi, that's very large. And you also have many, many subgroups of Jewish networks within the Ashkenazi world. And they all send, for example, remittances to the Holy Land to support their own yeshivot. But again, this kind of collecting of money goes along these individual networks, right? You would never have a Sephardi shaliach from the Holy Land going to kind of Galicia to an Ashkenazi community for money. They probably wouldn't give him the money, right? Because they have their own networks, right? They have their own people they give money to. And the one exception to this is the ransoming of captives. We certainly have examples of captives being ransomed who are not kind of part of the same Jewish subgroup. This doesn't mean that there aren't connections, but it means that communal issues are not always being addressed in multiple subgroups, right? They're kind of addressed and considered within specific subgroups. So if we think about kind of what changes in the 19th century, and change happens in different periods, at different times, we can think about kind of three theaters of change. And I define these more by the political status of the places than the origins of the Jews, right? Because you have Jews from Europe present in the Middle East and North Africa. We know lots about Ashkenazi in the late 19th and early 20th century in the Middle East and North Africa. We have Sephardi groups in Western Europe. Again, many of you probably know this map of emancipation, and we know that the dates for like Great Britain, for example, are off. Anyone in this room or online is a good map maker and wants to make us a map with the right dates for emancipation, that would be a wonderful service to the field. But it gives you a general idea. And the point is that Western European Jews are emancipated earlier from a political perspective, right? And that is the important point in this. So for them, kind of modernity, and if we just loosely define modernity a la Sarah Abraham Stein as choice, having more options, being able to perhaps change profession, be more secular, be more involved in politics, the choices in Western Europe are different than the choices in Eastern Europe in these shifts in modernity. So right, in Western Europe, and I think the date for Spain is wrong, but also you don't have any significant Jewish community in Spain writ large in this period, is citizenship. And citizenship is an entry into society and a reduction of disabilities. So in the sense of being able to join guilds, being able to go to elite schools. But this also leads to communal fragmentation. In Eastern Europe, you have kind of intellectual modernity, the Haskalah, right? But you don't have this same type of political emancipation, but you do have this choice in migration. And we begin to see geographic shifts of Jews going to Western Europe, going to North America. And you will also see other types of communal fragmentation related to, for example, Hasidism. So in whatever context Jews live, they are making new and different choices based on what their opportunities are. And the same is true in the Middle East and North Africa. As we look at the Ottoman Empire, and then also, well, Morocco in the later period. What is different is that there is some form of emancipation within the Ottoman Empire. Those are these Tanzimat reforms, but the communal organizations remain intact. So in the short-lived Ottoman parliament, you have Jewish members in the parliament, but they are the representatives of the Jewish community, for example. So what does that mean? Well, you don't have the same type of religious fragmentation. The religious leadership is not undermined in the same way that it is in Western Europe, for example. And these changes are driven by both these local changes, right? So when I talk about the Tanzimat reforms, but they're also very much driven by foreign influence, which I'll get to in a sec. But there are limitations to the citizenship, right? The Dhimma is abolished, but Islam is still the state religion, although of course in Europe, although Christianity in some places is no longer officially the state religion, it is still the dominant tradition. But you also have this layer of European influence. And there, as a minority community, Jews very much find themselves in a complicated position, which brings some privilege, but also, particularly in anti-colonial sentiment or decolonization, puts these communities in a problematic position. So, how do the Jews fit into this now, and how do they start contacting each other? And within a larger theme called religious internationalism, you have this development where Western European Jews who are emancipated become interested in the communities of the Middle East, North Africa, and Eastern Europe. And the reasons they become interested in this are multiple, and there are kind of two debates about why they're interested in these communities. Some people say that they are concerned about Jewish migration to Western Europe, particularly of uneducated, impoverished Jews from Eastern Europe, because this will reflect poorly on the community. These elites will be responsible for those Jews, so it's better to find solutions for them where they live so they don't migrate, right? Another argument is that within a context of colonialism, it is important to recognize communities that can be of service to one's empire, right? And so Jews can offer a service to their respective empire to uplift they can offer to their empire to help the empire in its expansion, right? And then there is mixed into all of this idea of, well, if we can make Jews ideal citizens, this will reflect well on us wherever these ideal citizens are. And then finally, these are newly received rights. And so there's this idea that we need to ensure the rights of Jews everywhere, because if Jews in other places lose their rights, it's a reflection of how fragile our own rights are, right? So there's a whole corpus of research on this, and I'm happy to give people some references if they're interested. And then finally, you have additional Christian missionaries who are converting impoverished Jews in the Middle East and North Africa in particular. And so there's this idea that this should be a counterweight. And how do they know about this? Well, they know about it through kind of emergent colonial administrations, but also through the development of a transnational Jewish press. And we generally talk about two events, kind of, which signal the birth of Jewish internationalism. The Damascus affair, right? So this is happening in Damascus. It's an old style blood libel, a Capuchin monk and his servant disappear. The local Jewish elites actually are accused of murdering them to make matzah, and they're tortured. And this predicament really scares European Jewry, even though it involves Syrian Jewry, and it is covered extensively in the Jewish press. You can read about it in the Jewish Chronicle. And two men, Moses Montefiore and Adolf Kreneur, they actually petition for the release of the prisoners. They're not very successful, but it is kind of one of these first examples that Jews from disparate communities are traveling and petitioning, right, for their brethren to be free. And if we fast forward to 1858 in Bologna, a Catholic nanny to a Jewish family, she secretly baptizes a 2-year-old son. A couple of years later, she confides in her priest what she's done. The child is taken away from his family, and although the Italian Jewish community petitions to have the child returned, international Jewry petitions to have the child returned, they're unsuccessful. And so that case really shows some of these global elites that they need to form a group together as a political lobby, right? That perhaps if they form these disparate networks, they will have more success in protecting their own rights via protecting the rights of their fellow Jews. And the Alliance Israélite Universelle is very much seen as being founded out of the Mortara affair. So for those of you who haven't heard of the Alliance, it's founded in Paris in 1860, and it's the first kind of modern Jewish humanitarian philanthropic agency. So it's not just charity, we're getting away from tzedakah, and now we're talking about this mission civilisatrice, right? So we're trying to civilize Jews, make them ideal citizens, and that this is the best way to fight anti-Semitism. This is the best way to guarantee that Jews will prosper in this modern and changing world. And one of the main ways they do this is through the opening of schools. And in many ways, they're interested actually in Eastern European communities first, but within the context of French colonialism, it is much easier to become involved in Middle Eastern and North African communities. And so what happens is that it's not simply the Alliance coming in and opening a school. These are actually partnerships with the local communities. And we can read in the archives of the Alliance that that the communities write to the Alliance and they ask for help in building these schools. And obviously, I mean, it's very much informed by what the French think is civilization, what the French think is a proper education. And we'll see in a couple of slides how some of the elites of the Middle East and North Africa don't always agree with the vision of the Alliance. And then kind of the little sister of the Alliance is the Anglo-Jewish Association, and whose archives are here, right, in Southampton. And then you have the Joint, which actually is a little bit later in the US, and the Hillspring in Germany. What's interesting about the Anglo-Jewish Association and the Alliance is that they actually kind of at one point in the late 19th century split up the Middle East and North Africa. They make their own little plan about, okay, we're going to take these places and you're going to take these places and we'll collaborate that way. So it's also kind of this idea of transparent, trans-imperial collaboration. But everything I've said so far has really been written about, right? And it very much comes from Jews from Western Europe imposing their values and their ideas about modernity on the Jewish communities of the Middle East and North Africa, or perhaps, what I haven't spoken about it because I'm not a specialist on that, on Eastern Europe. But the question then becomes, well, where are the Middle Eastern and North African Jews in all of this, right? How do they use these networks to assert their own agency and values within the empire? Because remember, I said even with these schools, the Alliance or the Anglo-Jewish, they can't really open a school unless they have the support of the community. One, because they're not going to fund the school by themselves. Most of the money actually comes from the communities. But two, if they don't have the support, no one's going to send their kids to these schools, right? If they're going to build a hospital, they need patients. So it's always a partnership. And then the question becomes, because remember, I'm talking about now France and Britain, but then you have other groups that become involved as well. They're working in really a trans-imperial way, and so they have to balance different political needs. And I think then when we kind of flip things and we decentralize Europe in this, how does it change our thoughts about modern European history? About modern Jewish history. And that's something that I'm still thinking about. So maybe I come back here in 4 or 5 years and I'll give you an update when my current research project is over. But I look at these Jewish communities from the Middle East and North Africa and the networks that they build along 3 lines: kinship, right? So who are they marrying? Business. Who are they working with? And philanthropy. How are they involved in both Jewish and non-Jewish philanthropic organizations? And if we take 4 families, you can see that actually they're very active in different countries, right? The Safras come from Lebanon, active within French imperial politics, very important in Brazil. The Commandos, Turkey, or Ottoman Turkey, frankly, French Empire, but also the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Sassoons, so from Iraq, British Empire, again, also have implantations within the French Empire, and the same for the Kadoories. And I will explain a little bit how these people are linked, but to give you a very simple example, during the Paris Commune, so this is like late 19th century France, the Commandos, who are Turkish Jews, right, Istanbuli, when it was still Constantinople, where do they flee to when they flee to Paris? They flee to London, to their friends the Sassoons, right? So we know they're in contact if those are the people that they are going to. And what I'm trying to do now with my current research is actually link who knows who and how they work together. And then hopefully also how they address different issues. And sometimes you see the term when you talk about these big families from the Middle East and North Africa as the Rothschilds of the East, kind of a problematic term. And, you know, especially when we talk about kind of racialization of communities, I ask people, okay, here's a picture in the middle. Are they Sassoons or Rothschilds? And the answer is they're both, right? Because in the 19th century, not only the Sassoons, but lots of Jewish families from the Middle East and North Africa have built trade networks, which are implanted in Europe, and they are marrying with the European Jewish elite. So right there, we can already assume that they have close connections, right? That they know about each other's communities and that they are talking about their different communal responsibilities. And we see particularly from the communities of the Middle East and North Africa, that even when perhaps the heads of the families no longer reside in places like Cairo or Baghdad or Constantine, for example, they are still considered communal elites, right? They still have power with the ruling officials. They still have financial investments in these cities. They still travel there and they still maintain charities. Similarly, even people who don't necessarily set up trade networks spend significant time learning in Europe. And so two examples of this are Heskel Sassoon, and he will be the first Iraqi Minister of Finance in the 19th century. He will be a member of that short-lived Ottoman parliament for the province of Baghdad. But he will also be a law student in Vienna. And he will also spend time with the Viennese Jewish elite. Similarly, Aslan Katawi, who will be president of the Jewish community in Cairo, will spend extensive time in Paris. And both of these men maintain those relationships with their European Jewish brethren throughout their lives. Beyond the Sassoons and the Kadoories, beyond the Sassoons and the Rothschilds, you have other marriages. So 3 examples of this. You have Laura Mokata, who is from an established old Sephardi Western Anglo-Jewish family, and she marries Eli Kadoorie, who was born in Iraq to a very modest family and becomes wealthy and establishes himself in Asia. And we know that, for example, Eli Kadourie's dedication to girls' education in Baghdad very much comes from Laura's upbringing and her value of Jewish girls' education. We also have the example of Zineda Polikova, and she marries Reuben Gubi, who's part of kind of the larger Sassoon family. And this is really an interesting example because Reuben comes from kind of the poor Sassoon group, but he's still associated with the Sassoon family. And so he actually confers the status, and Zineda has the money, and she comes from Eastern Europe, right? And then the final marriage is the commando to, I think it's Cajon d'Anvers in Paris marriage. And that one is very much a merging of 2 banks, right? So this was an arranged marriage. It was not a very happy marriage either, but there were commercial interests. And that is how this marriage came about. So we can see that you already have this idea of kind of business, family linkages. And how does this influence the kind of the middle and lower classes? Well, they will feel this philanthropy. They will hear about kind of why you begin to learn French, right? They will also, through migration, come in contact with different Jewish associations, and they will begin to read in the Jewish press about these different communities. With that in mind, this is all kind of a very brief, quick picture I am presenting to you. There are conflicting strategies, right? So we have this kind of normative strategy of the alliance, But actually, in the Middle East and North Africa, these communal leaders and these elites don't agree. So in a context of colonialism and nationalism, put Zionism, a form of nationalism, to the side for a moment, there is this tension between empire and independence, right? Particularly with anti-colonial ideas. And this is something that Jewish elites in the Middle East and North Africa very much need to balance, right? Because they are close to imperial and colonial officials, but they're also very much aware of the lack of support within certain areas of their local societies. And so there is pushback. There is pushback in conversations about how the empire is presented, for example, or there is a request to have more of a focus on local history and local education. So whereas in a place like Morocco in the late 19th century, the education curriculum of the Alliance is very much controlled by Paris. In a place like Baghdad, it slowly becomes decentralized and it slowly has a focus that is more local. And we see this most through language. We see that the local elite, they're not really local elites, but the people who, because they live in various places, they contest the languages taught. And they say, French might be a great language to teach our children, particularly our girls who are raising to be wives and mothers, but especially for our boys, they need to speak Arabic. And they need to speak Arabic because that is the language where we live, and they will need that. And so when they're thinking about citizenship, they're not thinking about the ideal French citizen. They're now thinking about the ideal citizen of the city of Baghdad or the city of Cairo. And the reason I'm talking less about kind of a national citizenship is identity is very fluid, but they're thinking about these ideas in a context of time and place. Similarly, many Western European Jews, particularly in the late 19th century, are very anti-political Zionism, right? In the Middle East and North Africa, the approach is kind of different. There's some intellectual interest in Arabic, for example, on potential agricultural settlements, but very much in a context of the Ottoman Empire, right? It's still the Ottoman Empire. It's been around for many centuries. It's not going anywhere. So there's an interest from this kind of cultural agricultural perspective, but not from a political perspective. And we also see this articulated as well. And that is how somebody can kind of identify locally with the history and the culture and still be interested in kind of these considered slightly funny and unrealistic early Zionists in Ottoman and later Mandate Palestine. And that will change, obviously, as things become more political. And once they become much more political, community leaders in particular will, I don't know what they thought personally, and there's some debate about this, but certainly publicly, at times espoused very anti-Zionist ideas because they saw it as undermining the larger communities which they saw themselves responsible for. Similarly, you see a tension between different elites on this idea of secularism and religiosity. How religious, how observant should a Jew be in the modern world, right? And the Alliance and the Anglo-Jewish associations, for example, they teach about Judaism, but they teach kind of Jewish history. They don't teach what you call Kodesh or religiosity. The Jews in the Middle East and North Africa, these communal elites, overwhelmingly stay closer to kind of a normative traditional Judaism than their brethren in Western Europe. And this doesn't mean that everybody even agrees. No one's a monolith. But for example, one of the most important members of the Baghdadi Jewish elite, Flora Sassoon, she actually thinks that the Alliance is way too secular. And in a later stage, she looks to the Beis Yaakov movement, perhaps as a solution. And she sends letters to the Mir Yeshiva, for example. And so there are debates about how religious these communities should be and what that religiosity should look like. And you regularly see in these letters, particularly in the context of giving money and philanthropy, but I'm hoping to find it in other areas as well, this idea of that might be fine for Jews in X place in Europe, but we are in Cairo or Damascus or Baghdad, and this is what our community needs, and our community is traditional, right? And so these are some very interesting tendencies to see. And at the same time, there's more collaboration with rabbis, because within this Islamic framework, in many ways, their importance is not undermined in the same way it is in some European communities. So you see the differences, and you see at the same time this attempt to work together. So when we begin to think kind of broadly about the Middle Eastern and North African Jewry in these global networks, within this context of the 19th century, within the context of these empires, they remain a defined religious community. But that also very much works within the context of empire. You have lots of different groups who identify in different ways, and Jews are just one of them. You don't see the same concern in either direction with religious reform. They're reading about what's going on in Europe, but it's not so interesting to them, right? This idea of conversion. Some people convert to Islam. It's very rare. Of course, that is different in Europe, where in a similar period, you have members of the elite, the Jewish elite, who are converting to Christianity. In the later period now, so now I'm talking about between World Wars I and II, actually the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa have more political stability as well. They're in a place of power, and there's tremendous socioeconomic mobility in this period. And so you see them writing about how they have to help their poor brethren in Eastern Europe, and that those are the Jews who really need the attention of these transnational Jewish organizations. The idea of citizenship is very different in a colonial context, right? Within a context of empire, only the very elite in the Middle East and North Africa will get French or British citizenship. So when we're talking about what an ideal citizen is, it's actually an ideal subject. And so I think some of the debates there might be interesting, and that's one of the things I'm looking at. Again, as I mentioned, all of these things, you don't have the same type of reformist Jewish movement in the same way. And also the responses to Zionism differ because of the close proximity to Ottoman/Mandate Palestine in the time period I'm looking at, but also to the political position of these Jewish communities and their concerns about their geopolitical reality. So I will stop there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Sasha. Thank you so much. I'm going to abuse of my chairman of the session to ask you a question pertains to your fellowship here and what you've discovered through the archive, and particularly around the imperial networks when you were comparing the British and the French and the ways in which they intersect, carve up the map along Jewish lines and not along nation state lines. If there were some kind of juicy details from the archive that you could give us, that would be amazing.
So today was my first day in the archive.
Sorry.
A little patient with me. But so, okay, so for example, today I was looking at the reports of the Union of Jewish Women, right? So this is kind of a spin-off of the Anglo-Jewish, and it particularly looks at issues that the union would support would be finding jobs for migrants in respectable employment, for example, right? That's the main issue. And I think in some ways that's almost a euphemism for making sure girls don't fall into prostitution, right? And it's British, but first of all, the way they formulate who is involved, they talk about the empire, right? So that's actually within a context of the British Empire, but now it's not just Anglo Jewry like on the British Isles. And you see that very quickly there's a branch in Calcutta, right? And the names of the women involved in the Calcutta branch, which I saw today, and then I'll have to like check my crazy spreadsheet who they are, but they're members of the Stagdati community, right? And then in a later report, you just see them talking about the East, right? It's kind of vague, but it gives you the impression that they're no longer thinking within the British Empire. They're just thinking that there should be women's unions around the world. And again, these are limited to kind of women's of the Jewish elite, and that they should be working to help poor Jewish women with their education, put them in respectable homes as a governess. You see a lot about making girls give auditions to see if they're good enough musicians, that they should get a fellowship to study music and otherwise to reorient them. So you see in this very simply the conception that like we are all connected and this is what we can do and we should report on what we do in different places. And then when you look at the names of the women, you see that it's not just Ashkenazi women, right? You see some Sassoon. The other names, it's a first step. You need to check because some names could be from different communities, right? But, you know, that's kind of the next step. So that's one example. And then the other example is how people organize themselves when they're in Europe, right? Because being a Western Sephardic Jew is very, very different than being a Baghdadi, right? Like it's very different. But when they find themselves in Europe, these communities come together. And so if we look at kind of the lists of Parnasim, we see Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And so now kind of the next stage is to see if we can see discussions about debates about how the communities are run. But there is certainly some flexibility in how the community is organized based on the input of Jews who don't come from this Western Sephardic tradition, although they are joining communities which are traditionally Western Sephardic. So you see this slight fluidity as well. Yeah.
I've got another question, but a question from the floor.
Don't chat with me, just ask. Oh, there was some.
Yeah, there's a.
Okay. Oh, Manasseh Meyer.
Everyone photos, otherwise that's
Oh.
crazy. Okay.
Yes, but Manasseh Meyer was the one with the money, and he was the main attraction about who to get the money from.
Okay, so thank you so much for a wonderful talk. Many of the early actors you've mentioned have been commercial and businessmen. Have you seen, and I can't read, have you
Seen
the rise of professionalism in local Jewish communities, doctors, lawyers, teachers, as an important part of this story?
So the thing about like part of the issue is the source material, right? And the elites just leave more sources, right? That's the first thing. We know a lot about the teachers of the Alliance because of the archives of the Alliance Israelite Universelle. So we can read about those teachers and their experiences, but your average doctor or lawyer, much more difficult to get in contact with, right? Like that's the issue. But the reason I had the slide of kind of the middle class and the lower classes is that these schools and these networks certainly facilitate socioeconomic mobility for the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa. And so there, when we talk about kind of the socioeconomic mobility, you see more Jewish, you know, doctors and lawyers and teachers, right? And I would kind of add to that engineers, for example, that's very common. And you see that funds are put in place, and they're put in place not by like Sassoons and Kuduris, but in families that have some money, but not that level of money for scholarships. And scholarships send students from Baghdad, from Cairo, across North Africa. You see this in the archive to study in places like Paris and London. And when they accept the money, there is the understanding that once they're educated, they will come back to their home city and they will be part of that community. And not just that they will be a benefit to the Jewish community, but that they will be a benefit to the larger society and reflect well on the Jewish community, right? And they sign off on this. And, you know, I would say it works 60% of the time, but then sometimes people meet someone, they get married, they find a reason to stay. It's a little bit more complicated, but this is very much set up so that people then stay. I mean, people then go back and they're part of the community. And hopefully also educate other people so that you don't need to send people to Europe.
Early knowledge exchange.
Right, exactly.
Can we go back to the slide where you had the Arabic and the Hebrew and the...
Oh, I can tell you what that is.
Do you want me to bring it up? Or?
Well, we still can look at it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you were talking about that in relation to traditionalism.
Well, I don't know if I know it's conflicting policies and strategies. So that's just the header. No, it's this one. That's just the header for Al Israelia, right? The Jewish world, or well, we see it in all its renditions here, not in English. It's just the Jewish newspaper in Lebanon, in Beirut, and it's trilingual. But the point of kind of the trilingualness and why I put it there is that this multilingualism, which is very much rooted in Arabic, is very present in the 19th century. Arabic might not be appreciated by all European Jews, but it is certainly appreciated by Jews of Middle Eastern, North African heritage, right? Like it is, they understand that even with colonialism, Arabic is not going away. Arabic is still important for business, for political reasons. And remember, this is happening in tandem in the late 19th and early 20th century with the Nafta, with like this resurgence in Arabic use. So, right, like end of the Ottoman Empire, no longer, using Ottoman Turkish for administrative things. So like these elites, they're aware of these changes. And in many ways, they're informing their brethren in Europe of these changes and explaining to them why they need to get in line with the local political reality.
I thought it was interesting that you have like the standardization of three
Yeah.
languages, right? You have the imposition of French through the Alliance, and the imposition of learning of French. You have Hebrew that's becoming formalized and standardized to
Yeah.
a degree, and Arabic, of course, in
Right.
that period is
Right.
hugely important.
And it's different. I mean, it's certainly different in North Africa, and the French colonial context, with French and, well, the role of Arabic and the way Darija is written, like, it's just a very different context, but certainly in what we would call kind of the Levant or the extended Levant, right? This multilingualism is present. All right.
Thank you, Sasha. It was super interesting. I learned a ton. I guess I wanted to ask about how coordinated some of the efforts were that you talked about. So both on an individual and an organizational level. So Camille and Montefiore, are they working together or they both separately see we need to intervene in this issue? And the same with, you called the Anglo-Jewish Association the sister to the Alliance. Are they working
Okay.
together or are they like each popping up in
Okay.
their own time?
So for Kimura and Montefiore, I guess I would use the term frenemies. I don't know.
Okay.
I'm looking at Noemi, who's really like the Kimura specialist and is in the room for those of you online. No, they're coordinated. They don't always get along. And there's some competition, but they're definitely in contact with each other. And there's a book by Nora Cheney called Les Inventeurs de la Philanthropie Juive, the inventors of Jewish philanthropy. And she really talks about this at length. Afterwards, the Alliance is founded, and we think of it as a French organization, but they have branches in England, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and like even as far, I teach in the north of the Netherlands, and they actually have a branch in the city of Leeuwarden, which is super small and like very north. So we think of them as being French because they have their like valeur de la République or whatever, but actually they're really like a European organization. And in a later period, they're going to become a Middle Eastern and North African organization. And my former PhD candidate, because he recently defended Roy Shukrouni, he even makes the argument that, the Alliance becomes a Moroccan institution. And so that's like a second stage, but like that the Alliance will take on its own personality in different places in the Middle East and North Africa. And if you compare the policies of the Alliance in Morocco to the policies in Iraq, so again, slightly talking about the later period, you can see this. But getting back to your question, so you have a branch of the Alliance in the 1860s in the UK, and they actually decide, no, we should just have our own association called the Anglo-Jewish, and we will work with them. And that I looked at during my dissertation, and the documents that have that discussion are here in Southampton. But it is based, and they are in contact. And then it's like it's not weird actually at all. I think it's more like history repeats itself in this case. They carve up the Middle East. So there's this example of the schools, that there's a school by the Anglo-Jewish Association led by a woman named Stella Korkos. And then it gets handed over to the Alliance, but there's an agreement that the Anglo-Jewish will still pay Stella Korkos's pension. And you have the whole text about it. And then Baghdad has more involvement with the Anglo-Jewish because the British mandate in Iraq. And so the Alliance pulls out, but they still have the Laura Kaddouri School, which is like the premier girls' school. And so you see how this like split up is negotiated. And some of it is about like soft power and wanting to be important, and some of it is about economic pragmatism, and some of it is about how the funders of these schools come from the Middle East and North Africa, what they want. So Laura Kaddouri stays in Aliyah school also because Ellie Kaddouri wants us to stay in Aliyah school. Laura passed away in a fire before this debate happens. And so they're like internal communal politics, which exist to this day. And are not, I would think, unique to the Jewish community. But I think what's interesting is this globalized dynamic that we find already in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century. Yeah.
And I guess the European narrative of colonization and immigration and obviously the Holocaust is much more familiar to me. But is that not on at all in the context we're talking about? Like, is there integration and assimilation, and what does that look like?
So integration and assimilation are very different things in the Middle Eastern and North African context, which is what I kind of started by saying. So you're part of a religious community, and you don't leave that religious community, right? If you want to be born, you want to get married, and you want to die. That's what I tell my students. You need to be part of that religious community or become an official foreigner, and then you can do what you want. So there are moments, I mean, and we're talking beyond like just relations with your neighbors, right? Especially in a place like Cairo or Baghdad or maybe Beirut to a lesser extent, where Jews are really important in producing this culture, right? Like modern Arab culture, they're important in cinema, they're important in literature, theater, music, intellectuals criticizing the state even to a certain level, then someone have to go into exile. But they're still part of the religious communities, although they try to distance themselves sometimes, some people who are secular. But it's funny when you read memoirs from the 20th century now of Jews who say, oh, well, we were very modern and we were very secular, but still had kosher homes. All the kids went to Jewish school. They still observed all of the holidays. And the big thing about being so modern was that they had some friends who weren't Jewish, and that maybe this is for boys who had more freedom outside the home, and maybe they ate a non-kosher kebab outside the home from time to time. So it's not the same type of choices in modernity, but intellectually there is tremendous exchange. And afterwards, when we talk about the uprooting or the dissolution of these communities, it's not linked to the Shoah. There are some communities, obviously, that suffer, right, during the Holocaust, but it's a process very much influenced by the creation of the state of Israel, but not only, I would say very much influenced by decolonization, right? And it's this decolonization because at the beginning, what I started with, is that because of their connections with Europe, which are linked to their Jewish brethren in Europe, but also business, political affairs, it makes them closer to colonizers in some way. And so then in these processes of decolonization, well, who are the local historic communities which are closest to the colonizers, right? It's a complicated phenomenon. And honestly, the uprooting of these communities is something that, let's say, we're still understanding the nuances of.
Yeah, I think about I suppose you look at it, one of the things we which is like how much actually associations like the Alliance or the other associations could actually do stuff, and there were quite a lot of limits where it was like
right,
or their lack of knowledge about the countries they were integrating.
Right.
What are the limits of the agency of the actors?
So I think the actors as individuals have a decent amount of agency, not enough to get the Jews out of jail in Damascus, right? Like, I'm not what I'm talking about, but there is an offshoot in Basra in the early 20th century, Basra, southern Iraq, of a theosophic group of Jews, okay? And the rabbinate kind of ignores them. And the Iraqi state actually also ignores them. Like, that's a communal affair. You deal with your own communal affairs. We don't care. And the rabbinate really begins to get upset. Oh, and I should also say, people are going to this Theosophic group also because it's a place where it can kind of be like mixed gender socializing, right? So it's also like, that's what's drawing the young people in. The reason the reason the rabbinate gets really upset is because they start doing their own kosher slaughter and they're not charging the gebel, right? The tax on kosher food. And so then the rabbinate gets upset because it's impinging on the money that they define as the community. How does it end? Eli Kadori in Shanghai writes, not only in the local newspapers, but also in like the Jewish Chronicle, I believe it is. I have to check in my book the citation. And he's basically like, I will give you X amount of money to shut this down. Okay, we can't have division. We need to be one community. And he does it. So like, that's a very like clear case. He just uses money to shut it down. But you do see these people using their money to get agency, but I want to be very clear here that this is within the dynamics of the Jewish world, right? It's not dealing with non-Jews per se. And there, I think sometimes there is soft power, but the question is what do they want? And this idea, not necessarily as conceived by the Alliance of their own Sciences de la Vie, but maybe as it's conceived by the communal elites, it kind of works, right? Because these schools, non-Jews attend these schools, especially in the beginning when there aren't other options. Non-Jews go to the hospitals which are built. So this is actually infrastructure building, which helps the state. And for a relatively long period, it is not seen as challenging any status quo politically. So that's kind of a soft power. But if you look at these people kind of exerting agency within Jewish circles, these Jews from the Middle East and North Africa certainly exert their own agency. And I think that's kind of what I wanted to get to in the talk, in the sense that we often think about how these organizations work or how these Jewish networks work from the perspective of Western Europe. But actually, a lot is going on from the Jews who either live in the Middle East and North Africa or come from the Middle East and North Africa and still have very strong connections to these places. Yeah. Right, yeah, sure. And I don't know if I can answer it.
Do these networks involve in
Yeah.
Because you mentioned the help that they
Yeah.
provide. You mentioned the knowledge of
Polycova. Yeah.
but you think that they
So it's
how about the king food?
yeah. So this is kind of what I'm trying to look at. And there's less contact, but one of the things I'm trying to know, so I have this database where when I find these names and I know kind of what organizations they're on the boards of, like I plug in the names to kind of make the connections. I think that these groups end up meeting in Western Europe. And I'm not saying they live there full time. I'm saying that they go there for political or for social reasons, right? And they're traveling. There's a lot of mobility. It's just that they don't get on planes and go for a weekend, they go for 3 months. So I think that there is some communication, but I think the difference is if you look at someone like Baron de Hirsch, right? So like he is very much engaged with Ottoman Jewry. We know this, and vice versa. But they're also thinking about like where to put people who want to leave. And so that's not a concern that Jews in the Middle East and North Africa have to worry about. You have some migration, but it's not the same. The other tension, I will say, is that the Middle Eastern and North African Jewish elites look down on the Ostjuden when they find them in East Asia. And so they really try to separate themselves. But I think in Western Europe, those with status, they're a relatively small group. There are not that many marriage partners, and there's a certain pragmatic idea that we need to work together for our mutual benefit. But the exact connections, the first one I found that's very clear is this Guri Polikova. So hopefully I'll find more. And I think you would expect them because you have kind of the big names, right? It's easy to find like Rothschild Sassoon connections. But if you go like one step down, so the people have enough money to endow a scholarship to send, 5 students a year to study in Europe, you have to dig a little bit deeper to find those connections and then to see who are they marrying, what boards are they on, who are their business partners.
Okay, so I think we should say thank you very much to Sasha.
Thank you so much.
And above all, we hope you continue digging and come back for another visiting fellowship.
Well, it's 4 weeks, so I'm looking forward to already joining this séjour. Thank you so much. Next seminar.
So is this the screening? So there's a screening on 24th of February of a real life at Harbour Lights in Southampton. Yeah. And yeah, and then the Parks lecture will be held on Tuesday, the 4th of March at 6 p.m. right here. So we're looking forward to inviting Lindsay Stonebridge, who'll be in conversation with Devorah Baum and Jonathan Leader. That'll be a wonderful discussion.